Hi, everyone. Welcome to this side event here at COP27 in Sharm-el-Sheikh, Egypt. For those of you joining us online, we're delighted to have you. And for the many, many people here at the EU Pavilion, welcome. We know you have very busy days. We're joined by excellencies, dignitaries, civil society, and just meters away from here, countries now entering the last 24, 48, 72 hours of the negotiations here at this implementation COP. Before we begin, welcome, first of all. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. The EU has organized a silent pavilion, so you have headphones. And also, thanks to the support of the EU Pavilion, there is interpretation in English and in Spanish. And so hopefully that will facilitate a really inclusive conversation. Beyond that, perhaps we can now welcome you to this event, which is organized by the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and of course, many partners in the room. We really appreciate your work over the years and your championing, together with many UN agencies, countries, civil society across the world. And the topic that we have this distinguished panel today to discuss is what you see here: addressing displacement and migration in the context of climate change. Now, I mentioned that this is the implementation COP. The convention is 30 years old this year. And until now, countries have been coming together to agree on a shared course. And now more than ever, all of you know the need for implementation. We know the direction, and it is the time. It's not also the first moment, but really a moment of mobilizing and increasing the momentum towards action. And that's where partnerships and integrated approaches for this action and support come in. So I'll turn now to the panel and quickly introduce each one of you. And I will just run down, and then each one of our panelists will have a few moments to share some thoughts. We have almost an hour with you today. And so hopefully after this distinguished panel, take notes. You will hopefully have a chance to interact a little bit towards the end. This is not the end of COP. We have a few more days. So if you don't have time to ask your question or to share your thoughts, take note. And you may have, if you're so lucky, you may be able to catch them in the corridors. So let me start with Mr. Stefano Signore, who will be giving the opening. He's the head of the unit of the DG INTPA, Sustainable Energy, Climate Change, and Nuclear Safety at the European Commission. And so we'll be hearing more from you. We go on to Ms. Jennifer Zamora, who's the head of the Department of Vulnerability and Adaptation to Climate Change of the Ministry of Environment of Guatemala. Thank you for taking time. I know it's really very busy for you as a country representative here. Moving on, welcome Ms. Farah Kabir. Farah is the country director of Action Aid Bangladesh, and we've been hearing so much about frontline communities. Bangladesh has been a great champion of the topic of human mobility, displacement in particular. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we're also joined by Dr. Ugochi Daniels, who's the Deputy Director General for Operations at the International Organization for Migration, and as an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations system. Your leadership and really high-level vision is very needed at this moment where we're talking about action. And then Atle. Atle, you've been a friend, colleague, as well as a really important voice and convener and leader for the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Atle is the head of the Secretariat of PDD, and you're constantly traveling all around the world. One thing that many of us have been appreciating a lot about PDD is you're facilitating the regional perspective and voices. So thank you, everyone. And Mr. Signore, we're really curious about your thoughts to share with us this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Really happy to participate in this panel, having worked on migration and forced displacement until 4 years ago, and now on climate change. Let's say I had the opportunity to look at this topic from both perspectives. And of course, let's say being here also, let's say, considering the chair of the PDD that we have taken starting July this year for 18 months. So really thanking the partners for this endeavor, in particular, of course, IOM, the IDMC. Let's say this is really very fruitful partnership. In this COP, I think nobody has to be convinced about the link between displacement, migration, and climate change. I mean, we have read the latest IPCC report. We read the news. We see that, of course, disaster, unfortunately, more and more brings, let's say, displacement of population. On the one hand, we can say that disasters over the years have become less, let's say, demanding in terms of lives. Loss of life is decreasing. At the same time, loss of assets and displacement are increasing. And we know the figures, which are really staggering. Internal displacement is most of the time let's say, the pattern, also because people impacted by disasters do not have necessarily the agency to move internationally, but at the same time, this also can trigger international displacement. And in general, let's say, there is also a perfect storm because many of those areas are climate change hotspots, therefore are already areas which are under stress for resource constraint, land degradation, drought, etc. So this for disasters, but of course we also have a slow onset, let's say, event like droughts, which are becoming more and more impactful in terms of, let's say, pushing population out of their traditional areas of establishment, and therefore, in particular, increasing rural to urban migration. Now, for us, of course, we have a focus on resilience, adaptation. Many of our initiatives focus on enhancing, let's say, resilience, livelihood opportunities, helping population to cope with the increasing impact of climate change. We have launched a number of Team Europe initiatives that address this topic, in particular in the Pacific. We have launched the Green Alliance, Pacific Alliance, and then we launched this afternoon, so I will not enter into detail, an initiative on adaptation and resilience in Africa. Overall, we are investing 30% of our means, of our financial means, in the current financial framework on climate action. And our president last year made an additional pledge of 4 billion euros. Just to remind that together with our member state and European institution, we have mobilized 23 billion euros in 2020 as climate finance. Now, coming to, let's say, what we want to do in these 18 months as chair of the PDD, together with our partners, as I said, we want to concentrate on 3 areas. The first one is to enhance coordination in a number of specific, let's say, strands, work strands. Certainly, all the data and research is one important area. We want also to look more at vulnerabilities, linking with particular stress factors like food, health, security. We also want to, let's say, enhance the nexus work, because we know that all this area, we need to work with many actors, humanitarian, development actors, and all the nexus work is very important. And last but not least, capacity building, access to finance, because of course we know that, let's say, the government, the administration in the countries which are affected do need, let's say, a strengthening of their capacities. this is a bit the first area. The second area is definitely advocacy and mainstreaming, because we know that we need to bring this conversation, let's say, more structurally in the multilateral processes, such as at COP, and making sure that basically this increasingly important topic is, let's say, considered in the multilateral processes. And then, of course, we also want to focus on the future of PDD, because we know that this initiative, which is, let's say, if we consider the very start, the Nansen initiative, is getting closer to 10 years, to a decade, and we need to think about what is the best way to, let's say, address, let's say, the future of PDD, so as basically we enhance relevance, added value, and so as, let's say, to connect all the dots with the other relevant processes and actions. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have to give a hand. Really appreciate these comments. And perhaps we'll have a chance to link some of the other panelists that we hear. Perhaps we can go on then. What about a country perspective? We've just heard of some EU or European Union strategic ways forward and some very important initiatives. How does it look from a country perspective?
Thank you so much. Good morning for everyone. I really appreciate this invitation to share different activities, strategy that we work in Ministry of Environmental in Guatemala. I continue my presentation in Spanish, so sorry. Importante para nosotros.
It is very important for us to present that Guatemala is a vulnerable country as many other countries because we are in the middle of two oceans. Therefore, this generates some climate events, some very extreme climate events, and this linked to the position and the different characteristics that Guatemala has. These are some social, economical, and cultural characteristics that make for Guatemalan population to be highly vulnerable to climate change, especially because the population is impoverished. They're poor. They are sensitive to climate change impacts, and year by year, it is true that we are living some impacts in climate change that generate some lost and some damages to our country regarding that we lose infrastructures, that we lose the different roads and bridges, that we feel that there is an obstacle and it's necessary to repair them, or sometimes to repair at a very big level. And sometimes in this event, the government is helping the government of my country. And on the other hand, my country has economical activity based in agriculture and in farming, and this is directly linked to climate change. Therefore, any type of change affects the crops, and a great part of the population has as mean of life agriculture. So we call it agriculture, which is very, very much needed. And this is the only wage that these people have, and this is all due to the different risks of climate change. And I'm saying this because the population in my country, has the need to search for ways to adapt, to force themselves to adapt to climate change. And another very important condition of Guatemala is that we are near other countries as United States, in which some opportunities, economical opportunities, are visualized. And in my country, this is seen, and we see this internal migration or international migration because people are searching for a way to live, and the population has the necessity to live their families, their communities, to go and search for these means of life that makes them have money. There was a record, an inform from the Secretary of Guatemala, in which it says that s- there have been $65 million losses because of damages of climate change damages. And I think the document didn't show how dangerous this is. So we need a mobility, a safe mobility, because we are forced to abandon our countries. I'm part of the Ministry of Climate Change, of environment, and we know about this problem, about this issue, but we need to stress out the fact that this migration is done forcefully, and this is an illegal activity. We don't have exact numbers of the people that are migrating to the north, but we have numbers in localized regions that um, data is being sent from the United States until here, and we see the necessity to analyze this context regarding these two very complicated subjects between migration and climate change. Therefore, we have carried out different actions with institutions in the country in order to start um, driving effective cooperation. In 2018, we worked in our adaptation national plan that has a specific chapter on human mobility, in focused in three actions about the analysis of searching for data that can connect the different information and raise awareness about the link between migration and climate change. And it is important to interact with the different institutions regarding the issue, the problem. We need to set some rules, a specific plan. Throughout this, there was also a big forum that linked the different themes of climate change and migration from the Institute of Guatemala of Migration. And 90 institutions took part in this forum, and we could see some results, and there was a plan carried out in order to act efficiently with this problem. On the other hand, there is a migration policy of Guatemala which is being developed, and it's important for us because we are taking part in it. And one of the axes that we're working on in this policy is climate change. Therefore, for us to be able to bring to the institution this theme is very important. On the other hand, we're working with NORAD, and we have been developing the project that links to act in these three focus areas in this action plan of climate change in human displacement. And we're in the final phase. We're setting out a plan, a project plan. We have been doing a very a project in which people are participating, in which there are different themes that affect the country. Therefore, all the institutions, the private sector, the academia, the NGOs, and the different institutions that represent migratory issues in the country are important. Therefore, the efforts are still not enough, but we are analyzing, we are acting, we are moving, the government is acting, and we're recognizing the link between both subjects, because it's true that we haven't worked enough, but we have started working, and we need to carry out different actions, because migration is a right, but we need to consider the fact that when we take this decision forcefully regarding negative impacts, well, it is necessary for us to support these initiatives. And we have some collateral damages that we cannot cover. We don't have the enough information. Thank you so much.
Jennifer, thank you for those thoughts. And I think, at least an impression that I had listening to you, many of us in this process have thought about adaptation and resilience. Of course, not you, but in the bigger narrative, there's been a kind of sequencing. First, let's do mitigation, and then adaptation, resilience building is somewhere mid-century. And what we hear from you really brings us back to the reality that it is now. And so when we talk about an implementation COP, and when we talk about partnerships and initiatives, it's just so useful to hear what are the needs of people, what are the realities that they're facing in their countries, what are the opportunities, and what can we do together to make sure that opportunities stay on the table, and that the opportunities both at home or elsewhere, if people go, are safe and regular and dignified. And I think many of you have worked for a lot of years to really make sure that that remains on the table and is part of our work here in the UNFCCC convention. I've also heard a lot about informing practice with data, so we're going to come to you very soon, Dr. Daniels. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let's go now to a different part of the world. We heard Stefano talk about some European Union priorities, what you're seeing and experiencing, at least from your perspective in a country, Jennifer. From your work with Action Aid, what are you seeing? And what kind of partnerships do you think are necessary for now and in the future? Over to you.
Thank you. While I'm here at COP27, I'm reminded that it was at COP in Bali that one of our women partners, or, we don't use the word beneficiary, one of the women participants, she went there and she attended the negotiation with us. And she was saying that after listening for a couple of days, she said, they're still debating about I's and T's and brackets. But when I go to bed at night, I'm not sure if a part of my house will be lost because of river erosion. And I've already moved 20 times. So I come from Bangladesh, from a country where this is the reality, right? And therefore, in this COP, as an implementation COP, our expectations would be that as these communities and our government have been working to address, adaptation is been very much present. Our emission is less than 1%, 1 ton. So it's in that sense, we are not the cause, but we are the recipients. And to be able to help the communities continue and move on, organizations like Action Aid have been working in the front line. But before that, the community itself had to cope. And they've been coping. But there comes a point when you think, how much more adaptation? We've raised the plinth, we've moved from the area near the water, the river or the sea, we've come inside. But we are 170 million people on a very small piece of land. And we are not responsible for these changes. This year, 2022, has seen the worst number of disasters. In 1 month, in a place called Sunamganj, there were 2 rounds of floods. So while we lobbied with the government and the government has taken measures to set up shelters, people moved to the shelter, and when the water was receding, they were starting to come back, and again there was flood. So they have lost their crop. They've lost their home. The children are not being able to go to school. Instead, what is happening, because there's lack of food, the poverty is rising, a lot of the young girls are being married off. And, somebody from one of my African colleagues used the word offloading. It hurts, but that's the reality. In a family which cannot pay or does not have access to food, you start offloading. And I'm sure that's not what we want at the global level. And people try to cope with whatever reserves they have, their little savings, if any, and then they end up going into debt. Then they because of the rise in salinity, there's health issues. The women that I work with in Sunamganj, they're having to use saline water to drink, saline water to cook, saline water for their toilets. And they're ending up with urinary tract infection. They're ending up with blood pressure, reproductive issues. So therefore, your question about how important is to partner and to work together, I would say it's in infinity, in the power infinity. Because we talk about economic empowerment of the poor, of the women. But how will you achieve economic empowerment when you're constantly being impacted by hazards, multiple hazards? You're losing your agriculture, your crop. Often in the migration space, people argue about, is it climate-induced migration or is it economic migration? Now, I want to ask, if I've lost my crop because of climate change, because of floods, I don't have economic resources. So why are we separating? Why do we need to draw that line? Why can't we realize, yes, people will want to survive. Yes, people do move for economic reason, for better opportunities. In this case, the better opportunity comes from an existential crisis. And once you move, you can only survive. And if you move to the urban slums were not prepared, are not prepared for 13.5 million people to migrate. No. Despite all the good intentions of my government, despite all the policy, in a budget, 5-year budget, our own organizational budget, we are all trying to deal with it. But we are not prepared. Where are the services? How will you provide water to that many people coming to the slums? What will be their income source? What kind of employment will they have? So these are the areas where we need to partner and plan. And in this whole experience of ours, we find that there's a serious gender disparity. Women and girls are extra vulnerable. If they stay where they are, then there's triple burden of care, of trying to find the water, because your water source might have been destroyed and you might have to walk further miles to get water. If you find the water, you don't have crops, so how are you going to make the food? But it's your responsibility because you're the woman. You have to keep the family going. It's my responsibility. The men, of course, need to move to find livelihood, and they move. And then sometimes we find they don't come back. So the women are left in an insecure situation, and there is polygamy, there is child marriage. Education, the young people, they are being deprived of their education. So for me, the partnership and integrated approach is at the core. We talk of empowerment, we talk of economic development. If you are trying to help graduate out of poverty, you need the climate lens. You need to understand climate-induced impacts, how it is displacing people. And where I come from in Bangladesh, we are trying to graduate out of the LDCs into a better situation. We are all working very hard. But every progress we make gets negative impact because of the climate change. On top of that, we host 1.2 million Rohingya refugees. We have given them shelter. So that means with my taxpayers' money, with another Bangladeshi's taxpayers' money, the government of Bangladesh is trying to support, of course, the UN agencies and international support. But end of the day, they are on our land. They are using our water. There's depletion of water. They're breathing, polluting in that environment. And no amount of money is going to replace it. So we need an integrated approach to also look at it. 170 million people of Bangladeshis plus 1.2 million Rohingyas, how we can work with all of them to address climate change. And we are a lower riparian. We are at the receiving end of all the glaciers melting and all the issues that happen on the ground. So we need serious programs for dredging. We need health integrated program, economic integrated program. If you work for women's empowerment, gender and rights, we need to bring that together. In the context of today, the plans that we had, the programs we had for women's economic empowerment 10 years ago doesn't work. It's not relevant. You have to make your assistance and support relevant. And my last point is that this is supposed to be the loss and damage COP. You can repair or pay for damage, but what are you going to pay for my mental trauma? For the child who had to be married off at 13 because there was no food or security. My son who has to go and work as a laborer or a rickshaw puller or who was deprived of education. How are you going to bring my days and my childhood back? So loss and damage cannot be debated. It is something that needs commitment and we need to address it here. I'll leave it at that.
Jennifer and Fari, you've given us a lot to think about. And I think if you're like me, you were hearing very common themes. People all over the world, just like you and I, trying to get to the end of the day, feeding their families, educating their children, seeking for a better life, and facing setbacks, as well as opportunities, but a lot of setbacks that look like extreme events and look today like what we think about with disaster risk management, that look like setbacks from development. And Faru, you captured my imagination because you invited us to think about, almost to reimagine, what is it that you are talking to your party representatives about here? What are you asking for the future when you talk about some of the agenda items, funding arrangements for loss and damage, or a global goal on adaptation? What are we thinking about? Are we reimagining what it could look like in the future? It's really challenging, but if you're like me, and I see so many fresh faces here, for those youth representatives here, tell us what you're thinking. Tell us about how you're reimagining these areas that were defined in a past century. How would you like partnerships to look in the future? Now, I'll turn to Dr. Ugochi Daniels. You're at the nexus between humanitarian work, development work, and would really be curious about your experience with partnerships and initiatives when it comes to climate change as well as addressing displacement and migration.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Coco, and good morning to everyone. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here and to be on this panel. So maybe a couple of things to start off with. And if you think back to the year that we have had, and it has really reinforced what it is that we know has come out from the science. But it's not enough. And that's why partnerships are so important, and that's why for IOM, being at the COP is critically important. Addressing the impact of climate is going to require shared responsibility. It's going to require solidarity with countries. But I'll be honest, what has really struck me is that if you look at the statements from countries most impacted by displacement and migration in the context of climate change, it's still not there. And if you've been following, the geeky ones among us, if you've been following the discussions on the global goal to adaptation, you can see that it's a struggle. So, and many of the issues that you so eloquently raised in your experience in Bangladesh, these are not new issues. We've been discussing these issues for many years. What has happened now is that the numbers have increased, the urgency has increased, the coping mechanisms have eroded. And so for us, at this COP, the COP of loss and damage, the COP of implementation, partnerships are critical. And Coco, you mentioned civil society, the private sector, of course, the community themselves on the ground is what's needed if we're going to go from talking about the problem, if we're going to go from addressing the politics that is impacting the discussions and really be able to get to solutions. So there are a couple of things I'd like to put forward. So first and foremost is going from the policy and the evidence to action and the role partnerships play. So, from the context of IOM, our role in the task force on displacement under UNF, CCC, and what we are seeing is that countries in their national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions, there are significant gaps there. And for many of the development banks for which funding needs to come through, the National Action Plan is the instrument for funding. And so working through these partnerships, supporting member states, making sure that the national adaptation plans, that those most impacted, whether it's indigenous people, women, youth, local communities, that their issues are reflected in the national adaptation plans, and that at the country level, member states are working with the different, in partnership with the different sectors. So that's one. Secondly, it's also taking the global commitments and translating them locally, and what are the partnerships that are needed for that. For an organization like IOM, we're in 174 countries, and we are at the community level working on local level engagement and participation so that these commitments that we make in these spaces come to life on the ground for those most impacted and whose voice we don't necessarily hear to the extent that we should, but so that at the community level we can amplify, we can work with them in partnership to amplify. But it goes both ways, right? Because you also need to be able to bring at the level of the COP what the local issues are for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. If this is really going to be the COP for implementation. And this year I've been to Afghanistan, I've been to Bangladesh, I've been to Pakistan, I've been to South Sudan. I've seen the impact of climate at the local level and what communities say that they need. And yes, many of them are in vulnerable situations, and yes, they are impacted by the humanitarian situation. But they're not asking for more supplies. They're not asking for more handouts. They're asking for support to build their resilience. In Afghanistan, what they asked me for were schools for their girls in the community. And so making sure that this is informing the global level discussion and the partnerships necessary to do that is critically important. And certainly for an organization like IOM, migrant voice, migrant inclusion, role of the diaspora. The diaspora are critical partners for delivering on solutions. And finally, from the perspective of IOM, being able to work across different sectors, right? You mentioned education, you mentioned housing, you mentioned livelihood, also important for water management, also important for land use, also important for urbanization. There are a whole range of sectors to which we have to have the partnerships needed so that this can be integrated if we're going to have a whole of society, whole of organization, whole of government, whole of everything approach here. So certainly our vision and commitment is to promote this comprehensive approach and then using partnerships as the vehicle for achieving this. And therefore, we're in, I mean, just for example, key partnerships, risk-informed early action partnership, REAP, climate risk and early warning systems, CRUISE initiative, and then the Center for Excellence for Climate Disaster Resilience under UNDRR and WHO. I know it's a lesson in alphabets and acronyms, but the underlying principle is partnerships to be able to deliver on the solutions. And you know, it's really important that in the opening, the executive secretary talked about an accountability officer now for climate, because it's all good and well for us here to be speaking on the issues and be speaking on what we're doing, but ultimately it's about being held accountable so that it's not just empty words. And delivering on addressing food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, damaged infrastructure, education loss, displacement. I mean, there are a whole range of consequences which we will all be held accountable for in terms of everything that we've said here. And we're only going to be able to really do that if we're working in partnership, given the scale of what the issues are. So, in our support to member states for people who want to stay where they are, and the mitigation and adaptation and the support that they're going to need, for those who are on the move because they were forcibly displaced due to climate, as well as those who will move as an adaptation strategy and for which we need regular pathways. I mean, that's what we are very committed to, and will, at the end of the day, say that we are going to be held accountable for. But being that we're here at the COP, being and recognizing how the politics is also, and none of us have talked about the politics, right? We're all talking from the perspective of social issues or technical issues or the science, but then the politics is equally important. So we need to be able to go from here to the action that is going to resonate on the politics, so that at COP, it's not just us talking about displacement and migration, but the decision makers, and that we are using our partnerships to amplify the local voice to achieve global action.
It's a hard path. We hear in some ways the future emerging right before our eyes. This process is 30 years old. It was established right at the end of the Cold War. Most of our ways of working followed those ways of working. And the world has moved on. And a lot of that is really good. Better health, longer lifespans. Yesterday, I was informed that the world passed approximately 8 billion people living on this planet. And in some ways, that's a success story and working together. And I think what we've really heard from the panel, and of course from you, Dr. Daniels, is the need to work together in strategic ways and in new ways. that cross maybe our traditional ways of thinking. So again, for the fresh faces in the room, we really need you to raise your voices, talk to your countries, help shape. Your voices, by the way, as you know, are really important. Raise your voices because they do echo through the geopolitical world. But let's move on. We're going to see how all of that plays out in these next 48 hours. Atla, we're going to come back to you. You're our host here at the European Union Pavilion at COP27. The platform for disaster displacement has a lot of reach across the regions. What are you hearing? And if you were going to give all of us who are active here these next days any insights that might be helpful, harnessing this momentum and turning them into these integrative actions and partnerships, what would you tell us?
Thank you, Coco. You're very kind, and I just wanted also to thank the European Union for hosting us today. I think this is by far the best pavilion at this COP in terms of sound and facilities, so thank you for hosting us. I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement. I'm head of the Secretariat. I just want to clarify that the PDD is state-led. So currently we're under the leadership of the European Union, and our vice chair is the government of Kenya. We have 18 member states as our steering group members, and IOM and the High Commissioner for Refugees are standing invitees to our steering group, and I'm very happy with the relationship and the working methods we have with IOM. We also have an advisory committee, and Farah is one of our favorite members. So we also have a civil society network, academics with whom we work. And we are very, very pleased to be with you today. And I don't know if I have much to add from what I've heard, and maybe we could have a few minutes on questions. But I just want to say a few things. I think we have heard the importance of partnership, but we need to also unpack what that means. That's a challenging task. But because we are talking about partnership between different actors, we are talking about partnership across policy fields. We heard about education, climate change. Jennifer spoke how about the government of Guatemala is bringing together two complicated policy fields, climate change and migration. We need to talk about partnership at different levels. We are here at a global policy dialogue or a conference which is implementing a legally binding treaty. So this is a global conversation, but we need to cascade that down to the regional, national, and local level. And one issue which I really think is important is the issue about under and outside of the convention. Because what we heard today is that most of what we have to do clearly needs to also be implemented outside of the convention. So we need to ensure these bridges. I think a second takeaway from me, Coco, is recognition of the issue. It's here today, and we need to act urgently. I heard a phrasing yesterday by the permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations in New York, which I think reflects an aim we all should have. And he talked about we need to hold the line on the 1.5 degree temperature goal. We cannot abdicate from that line of 1.5 degree. I think if we leave these concepts of the parties, that's the single most important thing we can do if we really want to make life better for those at the front of climate change. Because this is the end of the road, and I'm sorry, this is probably a bit too categorical. We talk about mitigation, moving towards more adaptation historically, and now we are talking about loss and damage. But that's the end of the road. There is no other measures behind that. If those kids lost their education, and if people are losing their homes or losing their lives, that's the end of the line. So we are running out of options. We need to fix climate change, but we also need then to scale up adaptation, because loss and damage leave us with very little behind. I also want to situate this very specifically in this conference of the parties and around the loss and damage discussion, because as you said, Coco, when we started, there are important decisions that will need to be taken today and the next couple of days. So in about 5 minutes, there will be a discussion on the Santiago network on loss and damage and its operationalization. That will probably be one of the most important measures we can make at this COP in order to have that framework for coordination across partners, but also at different levels, and make sure that we can work better both under and outside of the convention. The second issue is the financing, and I think everyone in this room knows that that is a very complicated issue. But I think we all agree we need more of it. We need different sources. I think I read a submission from a member state to this discussion. We need a mosaic of financing option. And this brings also back to my point, under and outside the convention. And maybe we leave it to our leaders to solve that very thorny discussion and negotiation around financing for loss and damage. That's probably beyond the pay grade of everyone in this room. But what we could do is we need more of that financing, and we need to scale up that dramatically. Finally, I just wanted to say, I know I'm taking a lot of time, I would just want to say that we also wanted to convene this conversation to mark the start of a project on action and support. And it's a project funded by the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, and it reads Project on Averting, Minimizing and Addressing Displacement Related to the Adverse Effect of Climate Change, PAMAD. I want to recognize my colleague, Lorenzo Guadagno. He's the project manager for the project. If you want to talk to us about that project afterwards, we will be lingering around. But also thank Jennifer and the government of Guatemala for joining us in that project, which we are hoping can be one little piece of contribution to the overall goal of averting, minimizing displacement. Guatemala joins 3 other countries, Fiji, Bangladesh. We are very pleased to work with partners in Bangladesh and the government of Bangladesh, and Kenya. So these are 4 countries that have shown interest in this project. And very quickly, what we seek to aim with this project is to strengthen data, strengthen risk assessment and the modeling so we can know more what to plan for, strengthen preparedness, strengthen integrated planning, and then also access to findings from a variety of sources. So hopefully, next conference of the parties, we can meet again and see how we have progressed on this and continue this discussion, which is critically important for the future. Thank you so much, Coco.
Atle, thanks to you and all of your partners in this launch of your initiative, your project. Wish you lots of luck, and we'll be curious next year to hear what success you've had, also what the challenges are. We've heard from the European Union, from a country representative, from you, Farah, from civil society, from the IOM, Dr. Daniels, and again, coming to you, Atle. Our time is spent. We have so much more to talk about. I'm going to respect all of your time and let you, kind of release you to run over to the negotiations rooms to continue talking about your partnerships. I hope we can all stay in touch. What you've seen here. Oh, wait, we have one more comment, please.
Just really quickly, because you're all going to rush into the negotiations, and because I want to recognize the panelists from Guatemala. So far, only Guatemala, Uganda, Benin, Samoa, and Antigua and Barbuda have raised displacement in their national statements. What Atlas said about the negotiations in the Santiago Network on loss and damage are critically important. So when you go forth with intentionality in raising the issue of displacement and migration with the member states, so that those who are of the pay grade that are taking the decisions hear all of your voices and those you represent. Thank you.
And don't forget, it's the women, girls who are doubly, triply disadvantaged.
And with that, everyone, go and good luck. We'll be here. Make sure to check the names of all of our amazing panelists. We want to thank each one of you. Wish you all a lot of luck here at COP27 and in the road ahead. Bye-bye.